Morning, everyone, and welcome to our Biodiversity Net Gain Business Bites event. This webinar is being recorded, and I'm delighted to take you through this morning on an introduction to Biodiversity Net Gain, and then we're going to hear from some key experts in terms of their approach to net gain, their lessons learned, and a little bit about in terms of how they're finding the whole net gain aspect. But to get started, I'm Julia. I work for a contractor, Balfour Beatty, one of the largest contractors in the UK, and I'm their biodiversity technical specialist. And I support our business across the business, from large to small, from new projects to maintenance, with biodiversity net gain. And what I'd like to start with, as always, this is a webinar, so a bit of virtual housekeeping. There is a chat function. So if you have any technical difficulties, we've got a team on board watching the chat. So if there's anything that you want to check in with them, please do so. But also, please make the most of our experts. We have such incredible experience around the room today, and ask them questions. Let's get the conversation going, and we're really keen to have this an engaging event. So use that chat function. It's at the bottom. You should be able to see it on the right, and it says chat. So you can type your message in and then press send. You'll get a link about the webinar afterwards. And we've got a few voting polls as well coming up, just to get a bit of a sense check of where we are. So we'll kind of run them, and we do keep a track on the numbers, so please do vote, and we'll see how things go. So let's start off with you. We are keen to hear from you, and if I can hand over the voting poll. So which organisation are you from? And in terms of client, developer, designer, contractor, subcontractor, and supplier. So if everyone can, we've got consultancy, local planning authority, and other. So if you just click on the one that resonates most with you and click submit, and please do so now.
So, Julia, on the screen now are the results.
Great. So we've got a couple of clients, developers, brilliant, absolutely, my bag. A large number of contractors, thank you. Got a few suppliers, consultancy, and some planning authorities as well. Okay, fantastic. Right, we've got another poll, if we can have this one. So this is all about biodiversity net gain this morning, but why are you interested in biodiversity net gain? Is it something that you're planning for? So you're actively planning to do it either as an organisation or on your project. Maybe you're actually implementing biodiversity net gain at the moment. Or maybe you're not yet involved with it, but you know it's going to come and people are talking about it and you just want to know more. Or maybe it's just a general interest in sustainability or something else. Okay, please vote now. All right, so real mix along the board, actually. We've got some planning, some implementing. Yeah, that's kind of equal and not yet involved. Okay, fantastic. We will certainly go through with you. So let's start. And let's start by thinking about, well, what is biodiversity net gain? And I think there's a really nice definition that always really brings home to me. Development that leaves biodiversity in a measurably better state than before. And I always find myself coming back to that place, because what it means is, because that development has happened, and that might be a housing project or a railway or a social infrastructure project, you know, communication, energy project, whatever that project is, nature's better off because that's happened. And I love the metrics. We're going to touch on metrics, but I find myself getting kind of caught up with the numbers, and we need to come back to this place. Because that development has happened, nature is better off and in a measurably state. And we know that already biodiversity net gain is part of the planning system here in England, so it's part of that NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework. And we know, certainly for England, that it will be mandated under the forthcoming Environment Bill as well. So it's very much come from industry, come from a voluntary place, but we're now heading to the world where it's really kind of cemented and formalized in policy. And I want to go through a couple of things with you, because everything that we do in industry is all about the benchmark of what good looks like. And it's certainly important that that equally applies to biodiversity net gain. We do it with everything else, you know, just with ecology mitigation, with carbon, with water, whatever that might be. We set out what good looks like. That's the benchmark that we work towards. So for those of you planning biodiversity net gain, I just encourage you to pick up these good practice principles and use them and apply them. And I'm going to go through a few things now. For those of you already implementing biodiversity net gain, sense check. Where are you on the map? Where are you about looking at good practice? You know, biodiversity net gain is not making sure the numbers tally up. It is about these good practice principles. And if you're just, if you already have implemented a few projects, we found it incredibly useful to look back and think, well, how did we do? It's challenging. I'm not saying it's easy by any means. And the more that we can understand what we did, where we possibly went wrong or didn't do as good as we can do, then you're armed with knowledge for your next project. So these are the good practice principles. They are free to download. I'll make sure that a link has been sent out with everything. And there's a couple that I want to start with. So the first one, you can see principle 1, absolutely apply the mitigation hierarchy. And I'll touch on a few things about that, but that's the process. So net gain is an outcome that we want to achieve, but the process of getting there is the mitigation hierarchy. And that starts with avoiding and minimizing our impacts as far as possible. Now, closely aligned with that is principle 2. Avoid losing biodiversity that cannot be offset or even restored by gains elsewhere. So those are the irreplaceable habitats, those are those statutory designated sites such as SSSIs, SPAs, and those aspects of those. And you can use that in a very practical way to embed net gain very early in the thinking and pick up, those red flags that would prevent a project from an overall net gain if you are affecting irreplaceable habitats or those statutory designated sites. But then really apply the process. So thinking about the process, and I work a lot on the transport network where our location is pretty fixed. You know, it's not exactly as if we, you know, that's the road, you know, it's there. I mean, sometimes I get to work on a new aspect, but it is a pretty fixed footprint. So for me, applying those early stages of the mitigation hierarchy is challenging, and I really, really rely on my engineering colleagues, because the best times that I've seen of avoiding impacts in very challenging and tight situations is when we have those engineering innovations, and they are definitely out there. You know, the moment that you start altering the angle of a cutting or an embankment, it can have significant impact on the amount of vegetation that needs clearance. The best that I've seen this happen is when biodiversity net gain is a core deliverable from the start. It's there. It's not something that comes in later on and you've got to retrofit. Everyone's aligned. Everyone's on board with the fact that we are building this project in ways that deliver net gain, and that's just it. Another thing, and for my contractor colleagues on the call this morning, when contractors are involved early, we get the best outcome together with our designers. Now, sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes as a contractor, we're brought in late in the day. But if you have that opportunity as a contractor, raise it. Raise biodiversity net gain. Raise your need to get in there early to help this fit. Because, you know, we equally have ideas and that innovation as a contractor to say, well, we think we can build it this way. That will avoid that line of trees. And the picture that you're seeing, this was from a very project when we did have great collaboration between the designers, between the engineers, and everyone was on board. And I just got this email a brilliant email saying, Julia, I think we can save this. It's bound for clearance, and I think we can save it if we reorientate our work. So thinking about principle 5, this is where the measurable aspect comes in. So make a measurable net gain contribution. And I want to go through a little bit on the biodiversity metric. So on the left, top left, you'll see that little screenshot. It's a calculation tool by Natural England. They released it in 2019, and we are waiting for a revised version. So that should come out later this year. And in very, very brief terms, if you start off on the left, it measures your habitat before works, and that type, amount, condition, location. So it bundles all of those things up, and it produces units. And then it looks at your habitat afterwards, and it does the same thing. It scores them independently according to different aspects. And again, it gives you your unit. So it is simple in that way that there's a difference between the unit in terms of how the metric works. But there's a really important rules that come with that. And I want to make this clear because this really comes into what biodiversity net gain is and what it's not. You cannot sum all your different habitats into a single unit value. So you can't lump together woodlands and ponds and hedgerows and all those things and say, well, we've got 100 units here. That's not good practice. It is about using the metric appropriately, such as reporting each broad habitat type. So you'll talk about maybe 20 units generated by woodlands, 5 units generated by grasslands. And that's really important because that underpins your specific net gain target. And the last point as well is we cannot get to a stage when we're kind of losing a whole lot of lovely priority woodland, but we're making up the numbers with ponds because they're pretty fast and easy to create, so they generate those units. That's not net gain, and I do want to make that clear. Biodiversity net gain is quite specific in this way. There's a strong structure in place. So if you ever see a project that just has a single unit score without anything behind it, question it. If you're working on the metrics, you know that you've got to report your units for each broad type separately, and that forms the thinking of your net gain target. And there's a really good question by Karen. Do you need to be an ecologist to use the tool? Ideally, at some stage, Karen, you would need ecological input. There's a small site metric coming out, which is a simpler version for non-ecological specialists. There's a way that you can use the metric carefully as a non-ecologist with very basic data, but you'd have to make that absolutely clear. And I would advise you get that initial training by the ecologist to work out where those lines are in terms of where the assumptions are made. But at some stage, you probably need that ecology input. But I've certainly trained up our various site teams on sites with very, very simple habitats, if you like, and they're fine. And the thing about the metric, and in the golden rule, early as possible, just use it. If we're going to get net gain in there at the early start, I don't know about you guys, but I work a lot with engineers and people who love numbers, and these are screenshots from the metric. It is not to do at the end of the project, look at the numbers and try to make them work up. It is a tool to help us use and to help us inform decision making. And at the early possible stage, you'll be not using great data. Okay, make assumptions, make that clear, and then ground truth them later on. But the best net gain I've seen, and the best I mean in terms of price, budget, quality, is when we use the metric early. But thinking back to our principles, we've got the process mitigation hierarchy. We know what net gain is not. It's not irreplaceable habitats or those certain statutory designated sites. We've got the measurable aspects. There's also this point as well about principle 5, make a contribution. And this is where I think that the biodiversity net gain piece really, really comes in. So, I think there's a couple of aspects here that I want to draw out. So I'm going to start at the top left of the slide, strategic planning. The local authorities on the call. But even if you work closely with local authorities, if you include net gain as part of your local plans, or even if you're a large estate owner, that strategic planning aspect, thinking about your estate, thinking about your patch and planning for net gain at that large scale, because then you can truly get some great outcomes. And if you look at the map on the screen, it's produced by Giggle in London, the Record Centre, who are just fantastic. And they have these maps, habitat suitability maps. But if, for example, we're looking at that and we're thinking, okay, well, these are all the places where acid grassland is great. And if you see these kind of 10% in terms of, that might be a 10% net gain in different patches, we can be really specific and we can be really targeted with our net gain. And yes, it has to align with the development and making sure that we're not suddenly achieving that gain miles away from the development. But if we're very specific and use all the data that's already out there, we can get far better outcomes. And the thing for me in that blue text there, so we're talking about this net gain, and the Environment Bill is put out there that it would be a minimum 10%. I mean, 10%, don't get me wrong, it's great, and it's certainly such an achievement from where we've been, but I want more. I want the best that I can get for nature. And the best might not be 10%, it might be a very degraded habitat. So, okay, we'll make it 10% better, but we can do more there. And seeing that bigger picture is tricky when you're working on an individual project. It relies on this wider look, if you like. So I think the contribution piece, what is your contribution if you're doing net gain, is really interesting. And this comes into play for Principle 9, optimize sustainability. And a lot of us work with many different sustainability sort of factors and points on our plate. And even more so under COVID-19, the connection that people have with nature is becoming increasingly important. But we already know that, and the evidence is out there. The most affluent 20% of wards in England have 5 times more green space than the most deprived. We cannot continue like this. And we need to be ambitious in our biodiversity targets, but in ways that benefit people as well. And that's a juggling act. I'm not talking by any means about downwatering the biodiversity aspects. We need to keep that ambition, but we can also target this. And if you look at the map there, the Green Space Index, it's free to use, it's out there. And it's really simple. The lighter colours are where people don't have access to much green space. And the darker colours is when the green space access is pretty good. So there's so many tools that we can use when we have this. And it comes to a point, after all of these metrics and tools and contribution and all these pieces, as a contractor, when I get out on site, the site teams, the foremen, they always say to me, oh, look, Julia, okay, we've seen your graphs, that's great. What do we actually do? What do we physically do on site? And after you've gone through the mitigation hierarchy, there's a point when actually net gain becomes wonderfully simple. We're either doing more or better habitat. And that's it. It comes down to that point. We're going to create more habitat, or we're going to make existing habitat better. And throughout all of this, and yes, there's the structure, yes, there's all the good practice principles, but it really comes down to that point as a contractor. We change the way that we're thinking and orientating our projects now, so we need space to do that. So that's an introduction to net gain and to the good practice principles, and the couple of aspects that are really key and fundamental to the principles. And before we move on, there's a couple of questions that I want to touch on in terms of how the metric seems to be best for large-scale projects, but what about smaller projects? And yes, it is cumbersome for those small-scale sites. So watch this space. Natural England at the moment are developing a metric just for small-scale sites, and I think that's going to come out early next year. So do watch these aspects. But we have now a variety of experts to run through that I'm particularly excited to know more about their work. And we're going to start off with Canary Wharf Group, Christina. And Christina, I'm really interested. I mean, before we dive into your approach to biodiversity net gain, Canary Wharf. I mean, it sounds quite funny because Battle Beatty, our office is there, so I should probably know this. But can you take us through, to start with, what biodiversity you actually have there?
Yes, sure. In fact, I might do better. I'll take you back 40 years and have a look at what we started with. And keep in mind that it doesn't appear to be green, but there is quite a lot of water habitat, and I'll come back to that. So moving forward 40 years, we've got over 4 public parks, over 120 hectares of developed space, potentially more in terms of water habitats, primarily commercial, now also developing residential space. And with that transition to residential, public realm is really taking priority, making sure that this isn't like the city where you might turn up on the weekend and it's dead. Actually, this is always vibrant, always alive, always supporting health and well-being of our residents, both in terms of species as well as human population. So if you were to come to these states, you'll see a variety of biodiversity measures. Some are quite visible, like the public parks, and some are less so, like the reed beds and like the fish walls that we have installed within the dock to make sure we support our water and aquatic population, as well as well-being spaces. And the more invisible ones are bird boxes and the bug hotels that might be hidden to avoid the public from being too playful with them. There's quite a wide variety of measures, and this has been the case from the start. So when the master plan was laid out, and to echo your point earlier, that how important it is to consider these things from the onset, biodiversity was a key part of, especially because the dock was quite barren, and we wanted to make sure that this is a place where the local community can come in and engage. So we wanted to bridge the gap from what we were offering in terms of the commercial space and the banks taking residence, but actually this is a place for people as well as wildlife, and building and supporting green corridors with our neighbouring boroughs.
It's really interesting to know just how much is there.
Sorry, go on.
So that's your patch, if you like. That's your green patch. So can you take us through, your approach to link all this aspect together?
Sure. So our strategy is fourfold, if you like, and the heart of it are the Sustainable Development Goals, which we've analysed through a materiality assessment, which looks at what do we do, what are our impacts. And just to remind those on the call and on the webinar, what Canary Wharf Group consists of is we are the client and the landowner. Essentially, it's our estate, but we're also a contractor, a developer, as well as the manager. So we manage the properties, we manage the infrastructure. And when we talk about developing the new residential master plan at Wood Wharf, essentially we are managing the residential quarter as well. So we've got on board designers, contractors, trades, as well as the maintenance guys who will be there looking after our species and replanting where needed, and really working with us on the long-term maintenance plans. So the fourfold strategy looks at climate action as well as well-being and biodiversity, going beyond zero waste. And this is where our plastic-free community, perhaps you might have heard of, but has been quite a prominent strategy. And of course, responsible business is at the core of all of this. So I'd like to today just focus on biodiversity, but I think it's important to remember that it's not a silo category. So when we talk about biodiversity net gain, we should be mindful that actually it contributes to well-being, and there's social value that could be gained from increasing net gain next to your development, or perhaps in the adjacent areas, of supporting local community and their access to it, as well as climate action in terms of sequestration and biodiversity offsets, which I'll briefly touch on later. So we try to maintain a holistic approach. It's not always so straightforward and succinct as this graph is, but at the heart of it is being considerate and really thinking about the appropriate solutions for the areas of estates that we're working on. So I've got a little map here to give you an idea of where different measures and different solutions have been implemented. So this was developed as part of our 10-year biodiversity action plan, which was published in 2018. And it considers a whole range of species that have been present on the estates. It is considerate of what was there before. So as referred to earlier, when you look at the 1980s photographs, we have a lot more open water. So we're aware of the fact that we're reclaiming some of that space, and net gain in terms of what was there before and what you're implementing, like you rightly referred, is about making sure what you do is benefiting nature. So where we are reclaiming some of that open water, we're making sure that actually what's there is in fact better. So we introducing fish walls and various types of solutions into that habitat. And of course, on land, supporting our population of birds, as well as thinking about solutions that could be integral to our developments. And I'll talk a little bit about Crossrail example, where reed beds and climate risk mitigation has been implemented with biodiversity in mind. So it's not a silo solution forced down by one engineering department onto another. It's actually something that we can come up with in conversation with ecologists and with our contractor to see what's the best approach and what's the best way forward. So in terms of who we support,
to see so
sorry,
much
go on, Julia.
Yeah, it's in terms of thinking about your detailed targets. Now, I know you've kind of come into, you've been actually targeting it and thinking about, I think you did a Natural England trial as well. Can you take us through those kind of aspects?
Yes, certainly. So I was just going to highlight the structure of our 10-year plan. It's set out around 3 core objectives, and it's available open source on our website. So if you're just thinking about developing a strategy, or if you're thinking about what would be the right way forward, feel free to have a look at. There's 2 kinds of plans. There's a summary plan and a much more specific detailed plan. It's available online. It's around 3 core objectives, and one is embedding net gain principles in our management and planning decision making. This is, again, echoing that early stage integration, making sure that the questions are asked at stage 1, not at stage 5 when you're already digging up the ground and taking trees down. And developing really clear actions for both climate resilience, net gain, and improving ecosystems and overall health and well-being across the estates. So from these 3 core objectives, we developed detailed targets, and apologies if they're not particularly easy to read. We cover, there's about 10 categories here, so from birds and bats and aquatic habitats, living roofs, parklands, ecosystem service provision, of course, climate resilience, health and well-being, as I've mentioned, and then also communication and education. I'd like to stress this one in particular. So we find that greatest value on top of net gain is actually engagement, and that's engagement with our local community, with local borrowers, but also with supply chain. And I think this is where this session with supply chain school is particularly valuable. So we found that upskilling our trades and getting them involved makes them our allies. So rather than sending environmental manager to site every time something goes wrong, our trades and people who are already there and as part of their daily job are asking the right questions for us and are thinking about what would be the better way to do this. And from simple examples like, our trades build bug hotels for us from FSE offcuts, and similarly builds bird boxes and are keen to find out whether they've been inhabited, and if someone's making use of that. And our fish wall built on Bank Street was in fact, rather than an off-the-shelf solution, was an innovative idea that the trades came up with, which essentially was a scaffold with, again, FSC boxes and some rope that our ecologists certified and said, wow, this is better than anything you can buy. And it all emerged just through collaboration and that communication and education of working together and really trying to be quite open about what we're trying to achieve and why, and then asking and listening to see what would be the right way forward. So the way we set out the strategy is we prioritized things that we can target and tackle immediately, but then also being mindful of our development pipeline and what can we achieve further down the line, so saying 3 to 5 years and 5 to 10 years. And of course, we'll be renewing this plan as we move along. And we found also that some of the targets have shifted, and they keep shifting, and that's a good thing because we are learning, or we're trying to be quite open about things that don't work and share those case studies. So to give you an example, one of our green walls took us about 3 tries to replant and get the right product that would in fact be, have the levels of longevity that we were after, as well as finish, as well as the type of species that would be supportive of our local wildlife. So in terms of the numbers, and I hope people don't get too put off with the detail, I'll touch briefly on our Ecometrics. So taking those targets that you've just seen on the other slide and then trying to quantify it was quite a challenge, and primarily because we've tried different metrics, and last year we spent a year trialing the Natural England Ecometric and thinking about all the categories that are and must be considered, how they apply to what we do, and how, based on the way the metric is structured, we in fact might be penalized for doing something different to what was there before. So for example, we got penalized for reducing wood production on site, and it's just to do with what was originally present, what we're able to deliver. And you have to, it doesn't always appear straightforward, and as per the earlier question, yeah, you do need to have an ecologist on board, but there will be other simplified methods, and in fact BREEAM offers a route to certification that is all about upskilling your team and not having to pay for an ecologist. But I would welcome early engagement with the ecologist, because if you're looking for appropriate solutions, and if you're looking to select species that not only relevant for the location, but also will support the long-term establishment and be climate change resilient and essentially tick more than one box and be really self-sufficient, so that what you want to leave is not dependent on your constant, or you're not leaving the community having to pay for significant maintenance bills. You want to make sure that it's there and it can look after itself. So that holistic approach does need some guidance. And whilst variety of industry bodies such as SOCENF establishing platforms on biodiversity that share all the case studies from industry and developers such as ourselves, but you do need some advice from an ecologist that will tell you and will help you work out exactly what's relevant for you, what's relevant to where you are. So although I strongly support upskilling and being self-sufficient, I do recognize that is valuable. And then the next step for us in terms of the net gain metric, and this is just a screenshot, but taking it digital. So, and this isn't just a gimmick in terms of, oh, look, we've got some dots on the map. This is about maintenance and making sure that we're consistent with what we've set out, and the kind of species we introduced, we then can look after them in an appropriate manner, and that we're actually on the same page. So when decisions are being made across these states by various teams to, potentially say there's an event happening and they need to cover the grasslands with astroturf, or if there's any kind of changes, that they're considerate of the wider strategy. And so the right hand knows what the left hand is doing, and we can keep moving forward and capturing the changes and the positive contribution where we've installed things, or where we've made notes on how well they're working in a more consistent way, and have it all in one place. Sorry, Julie, if please do stop me if I keep going.
No, it's great. I was going to ask you about you've got a couple of different tools here. You've got the Ecometric, and you've got this. How are you finding bringing that whole piece together?
Challenging. So there's always challenges. I think the greatest assets that we found in terms of getting this off the ground, and some of the more difficult conversations with asset managers and budgets, have been enabled through this bigger picture piece of actually linking biodiversity net gain with social value and health and well-being. So health and well-being is an absolute priority, especially now, on everyone's mind. And when I say that, I don't just mean improvement in air quality, I also mean mental health. And when we say that, okay, the new wood wharf development needs to absolutely maximize the amount of green space that we provide for our residents, not just for biodiversity, but also for social value and mental health and well-being, it's, I guess, in a way, it's more relatable. And then when it comes to procuring the right solutions, procuring the type of planting that perhaps is more appropriate, and it might be in some instances more expensive, but when we look at it through this lens and are able then to communicate it back to planners, that through this approach we're able to increase social value as well as climate resilience and health and well-being, that it really shows that it's a worthwhile investment. And certainly quantifying it is a big part of being able to have that value conversation. So net gain is one of the key aspects of being able to relate exactly how, because you see a lot of claims being made right, left and center, but I think if you want to maintain a robust approach, and also if you want to have a reputation of delivering what you've set out, you definitely need to measure it. And you can trial and test different metrics that are more applicable to exactly what your scope is and what you're able to achieve. But I would invite you to explore metrics that can feed into each other, and certainly consider social value as well as net gain.
Mm. And we've got a question about, how did you identify which metrics to use? I mean, the Natural England metric is kind of a done deal. It's government, I suppose, for us here in England, but obviously elsewhere in the UK, there's opportunities there. And so how did you identify which metrics to use? And so how confident are you that you got the right one? Is that what you were just saying about the test and trial approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And it might be that when the metrics are updated, we will shift. So it was done through a feasibility study that we've done a few years ago, and in fact it was part of when the 10-year biodiversity action plan was being developed. So we knew that we've got these targets, and I'll just quickly swap back. We knew that we've got the targets, we have a plan, but we wanted to make sure we can quantify it and measure it, and then be able to communicate our progress against these targets, so that we can keep ourselves in check, but also be quite transparent about how these measures, what are they worth, how are they truly contributing. So we did a feasibility study which considered a number of metrics, and Natural England Ecometric was one of. It was in collaboration and supported by ecologists at Green Gauge, who are also now helping us with climate risk, resilience, and TCFD reporting. So at that point, they recommended it based on the scope of what we were looking to deliver. And the decision was made to trial it for a year, which in actual fact, I think is probably not a long enough period. It's probably a minimum period, because you need to make sure you're able to deliver something in that time, and also that whatever you're delivering needs to have established, so that it's not a theoretical exercise, but actually you can go back and measure and really highlight the level of how well what you've installed is establishing and delivering value. So it's not just about putting some seedlings in and then saying, yes, okay, we're all green here. It's looking at, is it working, and is it being inhabited if you're supporting wildlife, for example, fish walls, and we only count them once they're being used. So yeah, the early feasibility has really helped us, and we are looking to continue to review whether the metric is the most appropriate for us. And we should be mindful of the fact that the units are not always the same between metrics, and slightly different approach might be more relevant for you. But I certainly just explore what it means to you and how it works, and I appreciate that most those on the call will be looking to do that.
Yeah. And do you have any final case studies to take us through? Because those are really and your final case studies, and any kind of final lessons learned or piece of advice for those on the call.
Sure. I guess the main one in terms of the integral approach would be our cross-rail development, which actually is behind me. The main thing to consider here is that the development itself was already and very much an integrated solution. So it's a station, it's a mall, it's a conference center, it's a wellness space, it's an open air music space. But in terms of biodiversity and climate risk mitigation, what we've looked to achieve here is not to make it an afterthought. And to give you an example of this, we knew that the impact of the development in terms of the displacement and what we are going to be experiencing there in terms of climate change and climate risk to the station and climate risk to the spaces that were going to be installed quite low below the dock level was significant. So when we were looking to implement and put in attenuation tanks, we were considerate of not just putting them somewhere underground and completely removed and out of touch, but actually thinking about how can we put in a solution that could mitigate climate risk, increase our biodiversity, increase and introduce fish habitats, and also provide kind of a wellness aspect connection to people coming in to use the space. So this is where a solution of the reed beds in the dock combined with the attenuation tanks and stormwater runoff has emerged, and it's been very successful. If you come and visit, you'll see the fish enjoying it, as well as the reed beds themselves are doing quite well. The only way that this was we were able to develop this is with having ecologists on board and having these early conversations at stage 1 and 2 in terms of what are we trying to do here, what are the priorities, and making sure that the conversation between different disciplines are equal, if you like. So from our part as a sustainability manager, it often is more about listening and more about making sure that everyone's voice is heard, so that we can find this equilibrium between what we need to do for a design solution or for the developing to achieve this holistic approach, and making sure that our civil engineers are not being ignored and our ecologists are not being ignored, and actually we're all one team.
Sounds certainly impressive, and yeah, especially the way that you've integrated biodiversity right in the heart of the city, but also right with people as well. Well, thank you so much. Is there any one
Thank you.
of just any final points that you want to make?
Yeah, I would like to just briefly touch on some of you might be aware of the net zero push, and some of those on the call might already be pursuing it. So from our side, we're developing a net zero pathway and setting quite strict targets, what it means in terms of the performance of buildings as well as our existing stock and retrofit. And what I'd like to highlight here is that I truly believe that net zero carbon should not be seen in isolation. And actually, there is a really great potential for biodiversity enhancement and investment into nature on the back of net zero carbon initiatives. And what I mean by that is that when you look at mitigating or reducing carbon, the reason we do it is to avoid or mitigate climate change. So then you have to consider about climate risk, right? So if you're mitigating climate risk, one of the best solutions for both taking carbon out of the atmosphere and also improving your attenuation and reducing runoff is, of course, biodiversity nature-based solutions. So if whether it is what you do on site, that's where quantifying it is so valuable, or whether it's something that you're looking to purchase as an offset, rather than offsetting your emissions via schemes that are remote and in different countries. You know, don't go clicking on the internet and buying your EasyJet offsets. Consider about something that's local that can in fact benefit your local community, and biodiversity offsets that are done with a considerable fashion, and they are going into the appropriate location as per your earlier slides, with the map exercising, knowing where it needs to go and the right species. I think that is a much more holistic approach towards both climate change and net zero carbon.
Thank you very much. And it's so interesting to see that not just the way that you've integrated biodiversity net gain into the city and with people, but also the wider view as well, that wider sustainability angle. And I certainly work, you're so right, you know, a sustainability colleague, and I'm lucky to work with some here in Balfour Beatty. There's so many things on their plate. You know, for me, it's just biodiversity, so that's my focus, but they're constantly juggling all of these aspects. Thank you very much, Christina. Right, so moving on, I'd like to chat with Louise. So Louise is Head of Sustainability in Places at Berkeley Group and has been working on biodiversity net gain for several years now. And Louise, it's more of a kind of a chat with you, I think, just to understand your approach to biodiversity net gain, but to start with, I suppose, where did biodiversity net gain really start with you and thinking about that aspect before we launch into your approach?
Yeah, sure. So I guess for us, biodiversity started, we were thinking about it a while back. We have our vision, which is our business strategy. So it's our responsible business strategy. And within this, we set new commitments every 2 years. And that was originally launched in 2010, and we're just at the moment. But within that, one of our earliest commitments was always about making sure that we had an ecologist on every site and ensuring that they did the right checks and they were informing our approach. And then in 2016 we decided that we wanted to take that a step further, and we really wanted to understand how we could start to think about biodiversity net gain and how we could try to incorporate more biodiversity into our sites. So in 2016 we kind of said that we wanted all of our sites to create that net gain, but we took the first year to really understand what that meant and how we would do that. So we worked with some external consultants to look at all of the different tools and metrics that were out there. And at the time, you know, that we decided to go with the Natural England and the DEFRA metrics because they were the ones that were the first ones that were out there, and we felt like they were the ones that represented what we wanted to achieve. And so we then looked at what other great work had been going on in the industry, and so we then developed our own tool based on those metrics, and then using the Warwickshire County Council calculator that they had come up with. We used that calculator to then use and understand how we could develop our metrics. But what we wanted to do with our tool was go that little bit step further and try to create a tool that could be used throughout the whole of the project process. So right from the early stages when the ecologists go on site and do their habitat surveys, making sure that all of that information is captured in one place, because often it's lost in planning documents. So we wanted our biodiversity toolkit to capture all of that and ensure that we were had one place where the project team could look and as a reference point. So that's what our toolkit does. It has all of that information as well as going through the calculation of actually how to get a biodiversity net gain. So I guess that's really where it started for us.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? I'm such a fan of the numbers. You know, when you're working in the industry, it's such a key engagement piece. And so, did you do any fancy dashboards and things like that? Because for me, that's just a winner when it comes to engaging people.
Yeah. So on our in the toolkit, you then have like a summary page which kind of highlights what your baseline habitat was, what you've been able to create through the design process, and then your percentage gain. And I think that the numbers really changed the conversation. You know, many of us have been having these conversations for a very long time and trying to get biodiversity on the radar. But I think until we had those numbers and could demonstrate something, I think that just really helped those conversations. I think you probably agree, Julia, that just having those numbers, you know, sometimes we do get stuck in those numbers, but the numbers are just the tool that then help us to move this forward and grow and learn and understand and, you know, ultimately trying to improve biodiversity.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, it's really been a changer for me as well. But having that balanced approach, like you were saying, remembering it's a tool, remembering it's not a numbers game, and coming back to that. So I suppose, so you started on that point, and then you developed your own tool and could really engage people. So how did you then develop it to not just become a numbers game, to really embrace biodiversity net gain and really make it meaningful? What's your approach then?
Yeah, so I guess we knew that, you know, we needed the technical stuff, and as the sustainability team, we wanted all the technical tool, but we knew that just wasn't going to kind of engage our project teams. So we really wanted to engage our land and planning teams and also our technical teams and just generally the business on why this was important. And so along with the kind of the technical tool, we then developed a design tool, which we call the 9 concepts. And the idea behind the 9 concepts was really for it to be something to upskill our land and planning and technical teams so that when they're going through the design stage, they could really discuss and start to understand what the tool was telling us and start to really think about what the key principles are of integrating nature and biodiversity into our development. So within the 9 concepts, they look at all different things from green infrastructure to seasonality and maturity to things like maintenance. So it was putting it more in easier, understandable terms for our design teams to then think, okay, well, when we're going through the design process, are we thinking about maintenance? Or another key term is connectivity. So making them think, right, we need to look outside of our red line and we need to look at what other habitats, what other specialist interest areas there are around, and how can we connect that up to our site. So that's what the 9 concepts was. It was just a tool to really start to help those conversations early on. And really, I think key to our approach as well is we really tried to develop it so that the ecologist was there through the design process as well. So Julia, you mentioned earlier that it's really important to get net gain as early as possible, and that's what we try to do. We try to get the ecologists undertaking their survey work and ensuring that they've done the distinct assessment, and then it goes through the design process, and the ecologists are working with the landscape architects and our project teams to really ensure that they can get the best net gain out of the site. And so it's not just, they fill the tool and then they go away. It is a process of iteration. Our plans change as well, so the ecologist needs to be up to date to ensure that those changes can make sure that there's still a net gain as well. So I think that's kind of our approach.
Yeah, and I really like the way that you were talking about, okay, it's the concept, the approach, but it's a process. People do follow a process if you map it out for them. And I think the whole net gain thing and, the principles are really handy, but they're a little bit kind of waspy, and it's a framework, it's a guiding framework, and you've just grabbed it and you've taken it and you've really made it into something very detailed, very practical, very tangible, that, okay, this is it, this is the process, this is how we follow through. And juggling all those different players, you have designers, you have ecologists, let's bring them all in together. So I suppose, and I know I want to hear about your case studies, because then it really relates to that. But just before we dive into your case studies, thinking back, that those kind of, what went well, what kind of lessons learned, looking at what you've done and just how much you've achieved so far, are there any kind of key points, particularly for those on the call who would be or might be part of the supply chain?
Yeah, so I guess the challenge that I think that we felt, and we made the commitment in 2016, and we've gone through planning, and we've got 35 sites that have now gone through planning that have made a net biodiversity gain, or will make a net biodiversity gain. But that's the point, is that they're still only in construction. They're still only in early design stages. We don't have 35 sites where we can say, look, there's the net gain that they've created, because it's such a long-term process. Development is such a long-term process. And I think that we're now at the stage where it's really key, and it's really, it's the next stage where we need to start to engage and speak to our supply chain and ensure that they understand what the design was trying to achieve, and that they understand how to implement the habitats that we've suggested through the tool, and really create them. Because there's one thing kind of saying at a design stage that you're going to create a net gain, and then there's actually achieving it on site. And we know that is difficult. So it's the lessons I think that we're learning are, we really need to carry on this journey and keep the momentum going, but work with the right people at the right time to ensure that it occurs. And now it is our supply chain, it is our landscape contractors on site, making sure our maintenance and management plans are also up to date and right for these sites where we want to create a net gain. And then I think just kind of really thinking about that early stages, and if someone's starting on their journey, I think, it's a process, and it's about learning and understanding and improving. And I think, when you first start something, it can be quite difficult, but the first few sites, maybe we didn't get it quite right, but we learn, and we're trying to improve that knowledge. So it can be quite a complicated process, especially when you start to look at the metrics in detail, and the all of the detail and the distinctiveness. And that's why you do really need the ecologist to help you through that, because it is really complicated. But I think just kind of, once you start to go through it, you understand it and understand how you can improve it. So I think it's a bit of a journey that we're all going on, but it's important to start that journey, because you soon learn and understand it. And I think people really get why nature is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always you're making such good points there that I just really want to bring out, because biodiversity net gain, it's a big deal. It's not just a big deal, it's so different from what we've done. We're coming from that place where legislation protected some but not all of nature. And I mean, God, ecologists, all they could do was defend those lucky species that were protected. So to come from that place of, okay, let's just try to, mop up the damage as much as possible, to now actually, because your housing development has happened, nature's in a better place. You know, that's such a change for our thinking, our behaviours, the way of doing things. And what you were saying about the metrics, the process, you know, all of that, getting that in place and then still learning and still improving is so important for us all to recognise. But I think I'm keen now to put everything that you've just said into kind of practice. So could you take us through your particular case studies?
Yeah, so I've just got one case study for you today, just to explain a little bit about what we've done at Kid Brook Village. So Kid Brook Village used to be the Ferrier estate, and this is what it looked like when the Berkeley Group bought it. So you can see that the landscape, you know, it is just non-existent really. Obviously you have the trees and the grassland, but from a biodiversity point of view, there's just not much value there. And you can see that you know, the buildings, they didn't really last as long as it was hoped that they would. And so this is where you can see that we were really starting from. And then I wanted to explain the journey of Kid Brook, because I think it explains where we've all got to and where we are going as on a journey within the industry. And so this is Kid Brook a few years ago, and this is what we would have designed. This is what we designed in. We've always thought that landscape and amenity is really important, and we always put it early on in our developments because of its value that it brings. And this is how we designed Kid Brook. This was the original part of the original master plan, and green space was brought throughout the development, and there was green fingers going through the development. So it was very much an early principle that green infrastructure was important, and nature and open space was important. But I think this is good landscaping, but it doesn't necessarily have the multiple benefits that we're trying to achieve when we're talking about net biodiversity gain. And so what we did is we then worked with the London Wildlife Trust to redesign Cater Park, which was the park that I just showed you. And you can see in this picture down here that we reworked the lake that was there to really enhance it and ensure that there was those multiple benefits coming out of the landscape, so that nature was really thriving as well as that health and well-being for the local community. And so I think that this is an example of what the difference is between kind of that journey that we're going on of green infrastructure and open space, and then taking it to the next level. And what we're really trying to deliver when we're talking about biodiversity net gain, that is really about putting different species in, making sure that there is a multitude of habitats within the development as well, so that it can really thrive. And this is the results now. We get much better engagement with the local community. People want to be there and interact, and it just is a completely different place and open space and park than it was previously. I think there's also been a learning of, you know, nature has different seasons, and it's important that you take the local community on that journey as well. But then that's what they really love about it is that, you know, when it starts to become spring, they really see this green space transforming into something more beautiful. And whereas the previous space kind of just stayed the same throughout the seasons. So I think it's really all about that connecting back to people as well, and making them understand the beauty of nature and why it's so important to us.
Gosh, that looks incredible. It really does. And before I let you go, and thank you so much. This has just been such an interesting insight into not just where you started, but how you've been working through this. We've got a couple of good questions. So COVID-19, you know, everyone's under financial pressure. And there's a question to just, you know, given those current financial issues, are you getting pressure from your company? I mean, are they saying now that net gain is a burden? It's a burden on the budget, or are you there enough in your process, I suppose, when net gain is just part of what you do?
So I think we're lucky, and net gain is now just part of what we do because they see the value in it, and the cost of delivering this is getting it right in the early design stages. So it's upfront early costs. It doesn't necessarily cost, and if you're doing that through the early design processes, it shouldn't cost much more in the long run, and the value that it brings, it just outweighs any of the costs, and that's really where we've seen it in our developments. And so we're not experiencing that. It's as long as you get it in the early design stages, that's when the costs stay minimal. It's when you're trying to, go back or retrofit it, when, the design is kind of finished, and then you need to try to create a net gain at that point, that's when it's just really complicated. So as long as you think about it from the early design stages, it shouldn't cost more. And I think once people experience it and see it, that's when they really like it.
Brilliant, brilliant. When people see an experience, that's when they really like it. I will take that definitely as a key message. Thank you so much, Louise.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Louise. Our final speaker, we're going to stick with the housing theme, and I'm now going to turn to Nicola. Nicola, Sustainability Manager of Redrow. So it's sticking within the housing theme. Can I ask you just to introduce yourself and Redrow for those of you who might not, be familiar with your work?
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Julia. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Nicola Johansson, Group Sustainability Manager at Redrow Homes. Really lucky to be charged with leading on biodiversity work for the group. I'm not an ecologist. I don't have a technical ecology background, but a real deep interest in nature and a real passion for this area of work. So I've been really enjoying getting to grips with this agenda for Redrow. Just to tell a little bit about, for those of you who don't know about Redrow, just very briefly, housing developer operating across England and Wales, 15 divisions across those areas. And just to give you an idea of the size of us, just over 4,000 homes built last year in those areas. And an organisation that has long prided itself on its product and the quality of its product and placemaking agenda as well. We're doing a lot of work on placemaking across the business over the last few years. And we've seen this growing emphasis in the business and more widely in society, of course, as well, on looking at nature and well-being for the communities in which we're creating and which we're influencing as well. So that just gives you a very brief idea of who we are really and who I am.
Hi, Nicola. So would you be able to go through your next slides? Julia is just trying to reconnect with her sound.
No problem. That's absolutely fine. Yeah. So, you there, Julia? No. Okay. Yeah. No problem. I was just going to talk a little bit to introduce where we started really with biodiversity net gain, to give you a bit of a feel of how this agenda came to being for us really. And it was about 3 to 4 years ago we started to look in a similar way to Krista described for Canary Wharf. Really, we looked at our purpose as an organisation and started to re-articulate what that meant for us as a business. And as you can see on the slide around the outside there, we came up with 3 key areas that we thought described our social and environmental thinking at the time. And within these 3 areas, so developing thriving communities, valuing people and building responsibly, there are subsets, sub-themes, if you like. And I don't know how clearly you can see it on there, but top right under developing thriving communities, one of our key themes that we wanted to tackle was nature for people. So in this idea of, okay, we're in the business of trying to develop thriving communities, we think that's important. And to do that without a focus on nature, it would be extraordinary, really. So nature is a key part of how we see thriving communities. Of course, around about the same time, we were developing our principles. The kind of political and policy agenda was also changing. So the 25-year environment plan launched early in 2018, and a lot of other kind of policy changing around this area, and it looked increasingly likely that biodiversity net gain will be mandatory for us. So of course, these kind of two different drivers, our internal desire to look at developing thriving communities and incorporating nature within that, and these external drivers coming towards us, meant that we really needed to look at biodiversity net gain as being a central part of how we would develop our nature for people theme, if you like. So after lots of the usual internal discussions and research, we established kind of two key commitments for the business. So the first commitment was to achieve verified increases in biodiversity across our developments. So that's the biodiversity net gain piece. We set ourselves a target of 2022 to do that. So of course that might be earlier now, depending on when the Environment Bill is finally introduced, hopefully very soon. So we knew we wanted kind of biodiversity net gain to be the heart of what we wanted to do for nature for people. But we had a sense, we had a couple of questions really. So what about thriving communities? And we had questions about net gain. Will it necessarily give us the best outcomes for nature if we purely focus on biodiversity net gain? So we had these kind of questions that were kind of buzzing around. And we didn't feel like biodiversity net gain on its own kind of spoke to our wider aims, if you like, of looking at thriving communities and the whole well-being agenda. We know that the biodiversity net gain tool is an excellent tool. It's necessarily very user-friendly and easy to get to grips with, but also relatively and necessarily kind of relatively blunt, I think. Then we also had questions about, okay, well, we don't have the in-house expertise either to really answer these questions yet and to kind of know where we're going with it. So we're really trying to find our way kind of through all these questions and this whole agenda. So as a result of all of those kind of questions, we came up with a second commitment really, and this was to develop a partnership-led biodiversity strategy that would enrich biodiversity, so that's the net gain piece, if you like, but also strive to connect communities with nature. And we would develop that strategy by 2019, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the partnership that we entered into was with the Wildlife Trust. We felt that they had we had overlapping areas where we wanted this similar thing. So of course, enriching biodiversity is key parts of what they're trying to do. But they're also an organisation that are very much interested in connecting communities with nature, which really resonated with what we were trying to achieve as well. So luckily they were up for partnering with us. And so we entered into initially a year-long partnership in order to help us develop and give us the expertise to develop this biodiversity nature for people strategy. And we seconded a landscape ecologist from the Wildlife Trust to us for a couple of days a week to help us develop the strategy. I don't know if Julia's back on yet, or do you want me to continue on with some of our thinking?
Yeah, Nicola, if you could just continue while Julia's still trying to reconnect, that'd be great.
That's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. So yeah, so we developed these kind of key commitments, started this kind of partnership with the Wildlife Trust, and so the next slide really is just about what we came up with really as a result of that work. So in partnership with the Wildlife Trust, we really did take our time about developing this strategy. So we did a lot of work. We set up, and actually this was one of the great things we did, and maybe one of the top tips really. We set up a biodiversity working group in the business. So that involved people from the Wildlife Trust, people from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, who we also have a partnership with, and internal people from our land teams, from our technical teams, from our master planning teams. And later on, we involve people from our customer and sales teams as well. And so we got this group together, and we with Wildlife Trust reviewed our current approach. So we did a really thorough job. You know, we visited all our divisions, we talked to all the teams, we visited lots of sites and looked at what we were doing well already in terms of biodiversity and where we could improve. And, you know, to be frank, of course, there are lots of areas where we could do things a lot differently. So it was a really interesting time, and that process, whilst helping us to develop our strategy, also really engaged our team. So we got them involved and coming to site with us, having a look. And so I think it was, although it took us quite a long time, it took quite a measured approach to doing it. It was an invaluable approach, really. And then we drafted a strategy, and then again we went back to the divisions and we held workshops with all our teams and said, this is what we think roughly we were going to commit to. What are the barriers? What do you think? And we refined it again. And we were due to launch our strategy last March, but obviously that was postponed for a little while due to the pandemic, but finally launched it this July. And I believe we've got a really lovely strategy, a very robust strategy. And it actually, I've just highlighted on the slide there that it's got 3 key themes to it. And within those key themes, I haven't put them all on the slide, but there are 15 quite clear commitments we've made across these 3 themes. And you can access that document. I've put the link on the slides, and I guess you'll receive those later. But just to briefly go over what the themes were. So the first theme we call nature gains. So this is about the biodiversity net gain piece. So this is about enhancing biodiversity. So one of our commitments in there is to exceed the 10% government requirements for biodiversity net gain where we can. So we're currently working on some pilot projects, looking at different scenarios at the moment for what kind of 10% will mean, what 15% will mean, what 20% might mean for our different developments. So that's a really interesting piece of work that's currently ongoing. But we also wanted to, and this has been alluded to a few times this morning, rightly so, that we didn't really just want to focus on biodiversity net gain or get caught up in the numbers, if you like. So there are a number of other commitments under this strand of nature gains. And one of them is about contributing to nature recovery networks, which I think is actually one of the key commitments that we've made. So actually getting the teams, sitting down with them and getting them to look beyond the red line boundary. So, okay, we can count the net gain within that red line, but what is this development doing in terms of fragmenting or contributing potentially to existing ecological networks in that particular area? So looking more widely, if you like, and also looking earlier. So another commitment we've made is prior to purchasing land, assessing these impacts, or whether there are any impacts on high quality habitats or nature recovery networks. So so widening it out, if you like, around the biodiversity net gain agenda. And then the final bit that I've just kind of put on the slide there are a few commitments in this area, but the other one that I wanted to talk about is about making it locally appropriate and looking at our landscaping as well. And we've done a lot of work this year already on our landscaping to kind of move it away from the traditional housing development landscaping that I'm sure you're all familiar with, to something much more natural, and that speaks to people in a much more natural way, and ensuring that it's locally appropriate. So we were really concerned that we wanted to avoid biodiversity net gain going on each site and go, right, we'll whack a few ponds here, we'll plant a few trees here, and on we go to the next one, tick, tick. Actually looking at the place that we're developing and making sure that we achieve biodiversity net gain in a way that speaks to that local area. It was really important to us, and that ties in with our whole kind of placemaking agenda that we're doing so much work on as well. And the second strand of our strategy is Wilder Lives. So this is a kind of fairly straightforward, really, about how we create nature-rich spaces throughout the developments. So this is about threading green space, ensuring what we call doorstep access for people on the development. So not, again, trying to avoid that very kind of numbers game of, right, we need to put some green space, we'll put it down here, and then we'll put the houses over here. making sure that we're taking into account how people will enjoy those green spaces. And of course, this whole area of what we've called wilder lives has really come into sharp relief since lockdown. The importance of people being able to access really nice nature-rich spaces in close proximity to their home is become so important, and I think will remain so as well. So there are a few commitments in here, but the other one I wanted to pick up on is encouraging community participation as well. So creating opportunities for the community to learn about the local wildlife, supporting their participation in the care of these green spaces. There's also a piece in there about edible planting as well, and opportunities for community food growing. So commitments to including those on our developments, which we already do quite a bit of, but actually making that much more of a focus for the business. So that's Wilder Lives. And then the final piece we called a Flourishing Legacy. Yeah, absolutely. And again, this has been touched on this morning already. It's so critical for us in terms of biodiversity net gain and that time it will take us to achieve those gains, which Louise already alluded to previously. But also, choosing the right organisations to manage our developments is something we're wrestling with at the moment. So we're doing a piece of work at the moment looking at all our management companies and kind of really developing a new specification and to make sure that the organisations that we choose that are on our list, if you like, have the same ambitions as us and have the knowledge and expertise to do that, and that we in turn are setting out clear expectations for them. And then the measuring piece, again, so important for us. So, if we're sitting here having this conversation in 5-10 years time, you'll be able to ask me, hopefully, well, did it work? How did it go? And that we've got some clear information across a raft of measures to say, well, actually, this bit didn't really work that well. We thought it would, and we're changing our approach as a result. And part of what we want to do, part of our vision for this, is being able to share that information in a transparent way and encourage others in the industry who might not be doing some of this work at the moment to take on this and be inspired by what we're doing as well. Okay, I'm just wondering if Julia's back and whether I take a little pause or if you want me to carry on, Rosie.
Hi, Nicola. Yeah, if you've got anything else to carry on with, that would be great. EJ's also going to be running through Q&A with you at the end of your presentation.
Okay, I didn't catch what you said. I think Julia's not back. So what I'll do is I'll just press on with my final little bit. Really, I haven't got too much more to discuss. So that's our strategy. That's what we were aiming to do. So I just want to talk a little bit, since though it's obviously Supply Chain Sustainability School, just to kind of broaden out really and focus on some of the kind of key things we've been learning. And it is quite early days for us, really. It will take time for us, we'll learn a lot more lessons along the way. But some of the key things, I wanted to kind of focus on collaboration, really, because it's obviously a supply chain event. So this fact that we can't do this alone. I've already talked about how we involved all our teams and the different disciplines in the organisation. It's vital to get them all involved, including our sales teams, because the nature of what we're creating is going to change definitely, and to manage expectations and ensure that our customers are very much involved with what we're doing is really important. But just to focus on some of the other kind of key players really loosely in what I would term our supply chain. So in terms of ecology and landscape consultants, we're currently doing a little bit of work here. It's really important. Julia talked earlier on about how it's very important to start early, and absolutely it really is. And I would add to that there's kind of a collaborative approach between the ecology and the landscape consultants. It's also really, really critical. And that's for technical reasons, so that the mapping and the plans are aligned kind of pre-development and post-development. But also, I think more importantly, to enable a more shared understanding of what's trying to be achieved across those two disciplines is really important. So to enable the landscape architect and landscape designer to really understand something about the ecology and the habitats that we're trying to either protect or enhance or create on the developments. And having both of those parties kind of, you know, talking the same language to a certain extent, I think it is our aim. So we're early days and working on this. We are holding a webinar for all our ecology and landscape consultants next month to get them more heavily involved in what we're expecting of them. Our expectations are kind of changing, of course, with our new strategy, and to get some feedback from them as well, and to start this kind of process of that more collaborative approach in terms of our projects. Looking at site teams and subcontractors, again, I think this has been touched on a little bit already today, so not to say too much about it really, but I think as a business we probably need to improve a little bit the level and the way that we communicate to our site teams and subcontractors information about habitats that we're both keeping or enhancing or creating on site. So there's definitely quite a big piece of work for us to be doing as we go through our projects to refine that process, I think, to ensure clear understanding from those parties. And in particular, we're focusing in on our landscape contractors from a planting perspective, really. I think it's fair to say that in the past, some of our landscape contractors, if they couldn't find or they couldn't quite access some of the plants that were on the spec, that they might have a little bit of free rein to kind of alter that slightly. And of course, that's going to change for us now. So we're looking at new auditing processes and training for our landscape contractors at the moment. So they're obviously a really key player in all of this. So lots of work to do with those guys. And then finally, just to touch on, to extend really what I was saying earlier about kind of our kind of flourishing legacy. So we have started work on looking at our management companies. So started conversations with them to try and understand, you know, what the difficulties might be in our new approach, and start to develop a new specification detailing what we will require from them. And interestingly, it's interesting to look at different management companies' kind of glossies, you know, and we've looked at some recently that, you know, that appear to be very professional, good management companies, but don't talk about biodiversity at all in their glossy brochures. So starting to find out who the companies are that we're going to prefer to kind of partner with going forward. Those with a focus on biodiversity, those with the ability or the willingness and skills to engage with the community on our green spaces in whatever way that's appropriate. Obviously on bigger developments, it might be that we're looking at volunteering and big events. On the smaller developments, it might just be interpretation and an ongoing kind of digital forum. And then also, you know, making sure, of course, it's absolutely critical that they're heavily involved in measuring and monitoring of our progress and clear, transparent reporting of that. So yeah, this idea of us, you know, we've got this fancy, great strategy, but actually it relies on so many different people, both within the business and outside of the business. And there's so much work to do for us in terms of getting everybody on board and understanding where everybody's coming from and what the barriers might be. And then just to finish off from me, just to kind of reiterate, when I was thinking about what I'd talk about today and what Julia might ask me, thinking about kind of top tips really, and actually it's coming full circle because Julia started talking at the very beginning today of looking beyond the numbers and how essential that is, and that's also what I thought I would like to kind of communicate as kind of lessons learned really, or lessons that we're learning. I wouldn't say completely learned. But yeah, this idea that local context is absolutely key to what we're trying to achieve. So trying not to get too hooked on the numbers, using the numbers as a tool they are to help us achieve what we want to achieve, but not getting too hooked on them. I think it's about asking, you know, the question, what is needed in this place and what is this place all about? So looking at existing ecological networks, I don't know how clearly you can see that, the image that I've put there. So that in the red line is the red line boundary of one of our developments. And you see where it's just highlighted in pink, just so you can see it clearly, that's existing development. So you can see it's an infill site on the edge of a town. and where you've got the two green areas and the green line coming in is intended to try and show really that actually prior to us buying that development, it was just a little green site. It was undeveloped. There was a school there actually, but a lot of it was green. It was a great route through that existing development for any potential wildlife. So whilst, of course, we want to go in that red line boundary, we want to count the biodiversity net gain and make sure it's an increase. For this particular, I think it's a really good way of highlighting that how critical it is for it to look beyond the red line boundary at actually what else is going on around here. And that will really clearly influence the design of that place. So can we still design this place and can it still be a viable development for us while retaining some roots through and not completely fragmenting that route through. Just wanted to show that visually. Partnering with the local wildlife trust is something that we're doing now. So although we've got this corporate partnership that still continues as we implement our strategy, we're hooking up our local divisions with the local wildlife trust now to try and build relations in those areas, so that when we've got sites like the one that you can see on the screen, we're also putting in new processes at our land appraisal process, so that we're flagging up any potential sites that we think might be sensitive or might have some difficulties with them, having early initial conversations with the local wildlife trust to get their input. And they're the ones that have the expertise and the knowledge of actually what's going to be appropriate in this place in terms of local species. What are the local site conditions, and are the habitats, if we're creating new habitats, what's going to be appropriate for that particular site? What specific wildlife needs are there locally? What specific species are important locally? And what's the local landscape character? So this idea of really honing in on that local expertise and looking beyond the red line boundary is something that we're really working hard at trying to emphasize, as well, of course, as going through those calculations and making sure in a measurable way we've increased what was there before for wildlife. Okay, thanks, and that's all I've got to say for now, so thanks for listening.
Thanks, Nicola. That was fantastic. Hi, it's EJ here at the Supply Chain School. Unfortunately, we've lost our fantastic chair, Julia Baker, due to sound issues. So I'll just take a few more questions before we kind of bring the event to a close. A question for you, Nicola. So a question around public perception, really. And does Redrow incorporate the kind of scruffy type grasslands with tall grasses and wildflowers? And if so, what's the public perception of those types of spaces?
Thanks, EJ. I didn't hear all of your question. Did you ask me about wildflower meadows and public perceptions of those spaces?
Yeah, so the question referred specifically to scruffy grasslands with tall grasses and wildflowers, and what's the public perception of those types of spaces?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think Louise might have things to add to this, because it's relatively early days for us, but we are very, very conscious that of the need to manage expectations, really. So the need to take our customers with us, if you like. So I think there are a couple of things here. Firstly, about kind of interpretation. So our customers, I think there's like there is a growing awareness among the general populace of the importance of nature and the crisis of biodiversity at the moment, and the importance of it in terms of well-being since lockdown. So I think we kind of probably leaning on the door that's slightly ajar, but we need to kind of help it open a little bit. So I think it is about telling our customers why we're doing it, so what the benefits of this are, and actually this is going to be different to what we've done before, but this is why. And that can be done, at very early stage in sales. It can be done through sales pack when you purchase the house. It can be done through on-site interpretation and through engaging the community through our management company process that I touched on. I think it is about just making sure that we're really careful at explaining what we're doing and why we're doing it, because otherwise the danger is, such and such down the road, they've got a really lovely mown bit in front of theirs, and we've got this wild area. Are you cutting corners? Are you cost saving? So I think yeah, for us, it's going to be about making sure we're really careful about taking the community with us. But I think there's a growing awareness and willingness for people amongst the general populace. So I think as long as we manage it well, and I don't perceive too many further problems down the line. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Louise, from your experience.
Well,
yeah. Sorry, I totally agree, Nicola, everything that you've said. The only additional thing that I would say is that it's just about ensuring that you're providing different types of spaces within your development as well. So making sure that the long grasses and the wildflower meadows are in the right places, and then there is space also for mowed lawns for the kids to get a football and play around. So it's about that journey you need to take your customers on, but it's also about providing the different types of landscape through the development as well.
Christina, what's your view?
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Louise has said in terms of the variety. So, we're not planting monocrops here, even if that is the best climate resilient plant available and it is appropriate for the local wildlife. It's about the variety. And at Canary Wharf, we're absolutely feeling the pressures of public opinion and having to achieve a particular type of finish to the public realm, so that, there's an expectation from our corporate residents as well as our visitors for a particular style of the environment. But the way we address it is by looking at opportunities for spaces where we can plant more climate resilient and perhaps high quality specific species, and where we can plant wildflowers that support our bee population, and engaging with the community. Now, I think engaging with the community is not just about explaining that, oh, this isn't going to look so good. It's actually about having a conversation. So would you be willing to participate in programs where you're supporting the planting? Are you interested in growing a garden? And certainly through our wellness programs, we're seeing a lot more engagement coming through to say, yeah, we're really interested in beekeeping, and what does it take, and where can we support the planting, and is there a scope for local herbs production? So it's really seeing what is the uptake and having this engagement conversation that can actually inform decisions that are being made with the planting. So the consultation process never really ends for us. So I know that typically it's part of planning and you do it at early stages and then you're done, and you try to address to the best of your ability what the community has said. And it is difficult when you've got residents coming on board and you may not know who your tenants are yet. I really welcome for this initial handover and building user guides to not be hand this marketing stuff and then forget about it, but actually it's an ongoing engagement piece whereby they can really shape their environment, having considered the targets and the work that has gone into making that environment achieving net gain. But the local community and the residents can really own it and take it forward.
Okay, thanks, Christina. We've got one more question here about nature-based solutions, an assumption about there's higher maintenance cost there, and then that can be a real issue for developers, and especially when the upkeep becomes a responsibility within local authorities. So how do you overcome that on potentially higher upfront costs as well? But I suppose there is that assumption there that does have higher maintenance costs. So Christina, what's your view on that one?
So we work really closely with the Tower Hamlets biodiversity officer, who's been very supportive of our plan. And the way that we address the maintenance cost is by being considerate of what's involved at early stages. So when we make a decision about what we're going to plant, we already are in the process of developing a maintenance plan rather than doing it later once the design has been set. So it's really back to what Julia was saying earlier about early stage consideration and working closely, and also being considerate of what does it take. So there is cost in terms of investment, but there's also man hours and whether the level of skill required to maintain it is appropriate. So if we're introducing something, the more self-sufficient it can be, the better. But of course, striking the balance with the value added in terms of biodiversity and also the well-being for the community to be able to enjoy that space is a tricky one. I don't think there is a one-fits-all solution. It's just through collaboration that we can find something that optimum and works for that space, and certainly get in touch and get to working with your local council and understanding exactly what they can do, and I would say that adjust your solution accordingly.
Okay, thanks. Nicola or Louise, anything to add on that?
Yeah, so I guess our example of Kid Brook is quite a good example, because we had the more, you know, your traditional landscape that was during the summer, it needed quite a lot of low maintenance, so it needed to be mowed every 2 to 3 weeks, and that came at quite a high cost. Whereas now, the landscape that we've put in now, because it's more natural, it doesn't need so much maintenance, but what it does need is more skilled maintenance less often. So it's just about using that budget that you have for maintenance cleverly, and getting more skilled people in at the right times for nature. So it doesn't need to cost more. If you think about it, in the early stages, natural environments and nature shouldn't need much maintenance if it's designed well and implemented well. It will just need, you know, more seasonal expertise to come in and check it, rather than your kind of every week or every couple of weeks it being mowed. So that's our experience.
Okay, all right, thanks. Nicola, anything to add, or should we just take one more question?
I don't think I've got anything particularly to add, just to yeah, we're just working at the moment on making sure we're getting our management plans done very early, like Krista said, so making sure we do that at a much earlier stage to plan in for these. I'm really interested to hear what Louise said as well. So nothing really to add. I think another question will be good.
Okay, the last question that's just come in is a question specifically for the home builders. What are you doing to address public understanding and perception around sustainable landscapes? For example, linking to the idea of if the site was designed to maintain the brownfield character of a site, including sparsely vegetated substrates, etc., which is likely to be multifold more biodiverse than anything newly landscaped. What are you doing to address this around? Again, it's coming back to that public understanding and perception. I'll open that to any of you.
Wow, that's I think that's a pretty tricky question, actually.
Yeah.
Quite a difficult question. Obviously, there are issues around our brownfield sites and how long they may have been brownfield, and the kind of level of biodiversity that might be had accumulated and is living on that particular development. So I don't think we've really particularly tackled that subject yet. So, but I think it's something we will probably look to investigate as we go forward with new developments. It's quite early days for us. So if we take a brownfield site, at the moment our approach will be fairly kind of traditional in terms of thinking broadly of what biodiversity gain might mean in terms of creation, but might not necessarily, if I'm honest, have much of a nod to the brownfield character that was there before. I think that's probably the honest answer of where we're at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Nicola.
So just from our perspective at EJ, I think it's about where in the development is the right space for that. So for us, maybe a brownfield character is more appropriate when we're incorporating a brown roof or a green roof. So that those are the kind of characteristics that we would look to create on our apartment blocks. But within the landscapes that we're creating within the public realm, we do want. We would be trying to create different landscapes there. So it's about trying to create different character spaces within a development. And I think when you have a larger development, you have that ability to create more character areas within your development. So that's when those kind of ideas can be explored more in the larger developments. In the smaller developments, it can be harder.
Okay, thanks, Louise. And then the last question, I'd just like to ask each of you to kind of give a short kind of summary response. But the idea of linking biodiversity net gain with carbon, so with capital or operational carbon and emissions offsetting. Have any of you started to look at links or around that side of things? I suppose if you could, give me a brief answer from each of you, maybe starting with Christina, if you're still there. Okay, maybe Louise.
Yeah, so it's something we're starting to think about, but haven't yet. But I think that there's a lot of potential as businesses and organisations make big commitments to carbon in the next few years.
Okay, Christina.
Hi, sorry, got momentarily cut off there. Yeah, so this is something, and part of the reason I've mentioned it is because it's something we're looking at in close collaboration with Tower Hamlets. So net zero carbon for us is a target. We're publishing our pathway this year. Our target is quite stringent because we're also counting emissions coming from our tenants. There's quite a lot that we know we're likely to need to offset, even once we've improved our energy efficiency and performance on the estate. There's going to be quite a big chunk. And the way that we approach in terms of biodiversity offsets is looking at what would be the appropriate solution? What could we do more locally if we were to invest into a local biodiversity offsets? And then how can we make sure that is verifiable, certified, but also has a long-term maintenance plan? So to give you a brief example, usually when you purchase biodiversity offsets and trees are planted somewhere, there is no guarantee that it's not being planted on peatlands, therefore unlocking more carbon rather than sequestration, locking it away. And also the maintenance contract, the small print tends to only cover 3 to 5 years, so the initial establishment of the species. So what we're trying to do is make sure that the contracts cover at least 30 years and that we're able to continue to quantify and monitor how the species are establishing, and the long-term maintenance is done in collaboration with whether it's local communities or in fact the councils, so we can support them and make sure that what is being delivered is of greater value, not just in terms of carbon, but also health and well-being and social value.
Thanks, Christina. And from a Redrow perspective, Nicola.
Hi, yeah, so kind of similar to Louise, really, it's something we're kind of thinking about, haven't actioned anything yet. When we do, it will obviously, we'll be looking at kind of local solutions, and, you know, tying the two things very closely together makes absolute sense for us, but nothing now I can report that we've progressed at the moment. We're currently also looking at nitrates and phosphates and how we link our biodiversity net gain approach to looking at water discharges as well, and some issues around that area. So that's kind of another strand, a strand of this theme as well that we're currently having a little look at.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. So I suppose watch this space, and we'll be here this time next year to see where we've progressed to. Okay, so just moving on. Rosie, could you move to the next slide, please? Okay, just to signpost you to a few resources that sit within the Sustainability School. You can do a search there. You can search by resource type or by level. If you're a beginner and it's all, you're thinking, gosh, there's a lot to get up to speed with here. We've got some beginner level resources in there, going right back to basics around just a short video there on what is biodiversity and why is it important on site. That's a good one for your site teams and contractors. We've got the e-learning module that's an introduction to biodiversity. And then again, this is just to give you a feel for some of the types of resources we've got. We've got lots of case studies in there around net gain. We've got the Kid Brook Village case study that we heard about earlier on today. We've got Canary Wharf Group's resources in there, links to the metric, linked to the biodiversity net gain good practice principles that Julia referenced a lot this morning. So we'll be sending you the slides after today, along with some suggested links for resources to have a look at. But other than that, I think that brings us to the end of the session. So thanks everybody. Thank you to all our speakers. And thank you to Julia, who's probably listening, but we can't hear her, for chairing the session earlier. So yeah, please could you complete the feedback? You'll be automatically taken to that when the event closes. So that's really helpful for us to understand how to improve future sessions. So thanks everybody.
Thank you.